Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Masonic Seminar Series. As promised, we're going to start 5 minutes after the hour. I want to welcome all of our North American attendees, as well as those coming from the Philippines, which I say good morning to you, and those that are coming from around the world. Thank you for spending your time with us this evening. I have in front of me my notes to keep me on track, so if you see me keep looking down, it's just to make sure that I hit all the topics I need to cover this evening. First and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about the Masonic Seminar for those who are joining us for the first time. Always what we look at is people who, they get a little nervous because they feel like, they're coming in at the end of the year, they've missed a lot of material because we meet once a month. And that's simply not the case because every month is a standalone topic. So that way we can accommodate the influx of inquirers that come throughout the year, and we can provide information that is specific for those who may be joining us just for that topic of the month. So the Masonic Seminar Series was started in 2018 as the African orientation, as we had many people from the African continent who really didn't understand what Freemasonry was. They confused it a lot with the Illuminati, which we are not. And so we realized we needed to give out more information about Freemasonry without giving away the rites and the rituals and the secrets that Freemasonry possesses. So what you'll find here tonight is, although we'll be very specific in some ways, and other ways you'll see I'll be very, very general, because we do not disclose what we do in our rituals at all. So for those who are Masons coming from other obediences, I welcome you as well, but please be mindful that if you speak and I cut you off or I stop you from saying something, it isn't meant as no disrespect, but just want to make sure that we maintain the conservative nature of what we tell our secrets and rituals about. So the Masonic Seminar Series has grown since 2018 into the Masonic, African orientation into the Masonic Seminar Series, and has we've had quite a bit of success with it. A lot of people have found that although we give a lot of information which helps build out their knowledge of Freemasonry, it doesn't destroy the experience of initiation or becoming a Freemason by divulging things too soon. So we're very happy with the growth that we have seen here at Masonic Seminar Series. I have in here at the general office with me, Brother Patrick Alessandra, who is running all of our social media platforms that we're streaming on, which is Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, or Twitter, I guess is X, YouTube, and of course, for those who are joining us on Zoom. So to everyone that is joining us from wherever you're joining us, welcome. My name is Katie Concier, and I have been a member of Universal Co-Masonry since 2002.
Office with
I
me,
have
Brother
enjoyed every
Patrick
minute of
Alessandra, who's running
what you will
all
see
of
in
our
these
social media
presentations
platforms
are only
that
my
we're streaming on, which
not
is
just my
Facebook,
opinions, but my
Twitch, Twitter, YouTube,
my
or,
study over the last
Twitter, I guess
few
is
decades
X,
of,
YouTube, and of
just
course
trying to
for those
understand
who are
what
joining us
Freemasonry
on Zoom.
It
So
is
to everyone that is
rich
joining us
in
from
so
wherever
many
you're joining
different
us,
places
welcome.
that
My name is
I
Katie
will be studying the
Concier,
rest
and
of
I
my
have
life
been a
and never be
member
able
of
to fully
Universal
saturate
Co-Masonry since
my understanding of
2002.
what
Office
Freemasonry
with me, Brother
is.
Every minute
Patrick
of this
Alessandra, who's
what
running
you will
all
see
of
in these
as I often tell
platforms
brothers
that
that I
are
study
streaming on,
with, you're
which
tired
is
of the board
Facebook,
Masonry
Twitch,
because you're not
Twitter,
paying attention. There's a
YouTube,
lot going
study
on.
over the last Twitter, I few guess is decades.
Just in symbolism
YouTube,
alone,
and of course
trying to
for those
understand
who
what
are joining
Freemasonry
us on
is.
Zoom.
It
So
is
to everyone that is joining us
and
from
for those who are
wherever
familiar
you're
with
joining
our
us,
other platform,
my name is
Katie
Katie Concier, and I have been a
Society,
member of
the Masonic Seminar is a little bit different than
what
MCS.
Freemasonry
In that
is.
we have
Every minute of this
structured
what you will see as I often tell brothers that are streaming on, which is my Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, study over the Twitter, I guess is
just
I will stop,
YouTube,
and of course
I will stop for comments and questions.
So to everyone that is joining us, for those who are familiar with our other platform, my name is Katie Concier,
and then we can
the Masonic Seminar and understanding
my only request is that you
every minute of this what you see as I often tell brothers that are streaming on, which is Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube.
So if I tell you to refer that question,
I will stop, and of course
I will stop for comments and questions. Lastly, the last thing I want to say is delve into your history of your question.
My name is Katie
That
Concier,
and then so that seminar is going to start to answer any questions about the things, whether it's about whether it's about communication, the status of it, or if you're looking at that, Brother Patrick, the last thing I want to do is delve into your history with that also being said, Brother Patrick, so if you have any children of that seminar, it's very hard to is that it? Whether it's and we also have Brother Patrick, which is like that, right, so let's go for it. One of the challenges I have for that in general office of investigation, I get to work with brothers one of a couple brothers that I've worked with for the international Masonic questions. Some of it is benevolent, curious, how we came about. There's always clandestine, regular that gets thrown around. They know the meeting, and they don't. So hopefully we put that aside that stuff that I've heard under the international, and also oftentimes we get some literacy and we get a real question. So my hope tonight is some of it is put to rest that every Masonic obedience that I have, that is follow the landmark, that was going to know the meter, so we'll be able to put that thought to rest. I've broken it into two parts, and there's a lot here, so some of the stuff I'm not going to read my whole life. Put around after that. Most of our the ancient world, the early modern era, and then we'll stop moving with it to have that so that's kind of how it's broken it into two parts. And there's a lot here, so some of the stuff and that starts all the way back to time. So here is oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, how old is it? Seems like lots of time in the morning. And that is simply a thing I can not know how old it is. My recommendation for you, I'd like to tell you the grand and so look here on the upper left corner, you see that we're going to start with the ancient principles. I'm not going to break down, that's a whole other, and that starts a whole series of going through all the different, actually, oftentimes here in Egyptian table, looking at the ancient principles. We'll go into the Western tradition and we'll move our way through into the early 18th century, late 19th century, and we'll stop. So that's where we're headed. Just to kind of lay down the background of Universal Co-Masonry. I'd like to say that, the history of Universal Co-Masonry is pristine and clean, and there's nothing, there's no troubles, no styles. We'll go into this natural tradition and we'll move our way through Freemasonry. It's going to have schisms, spikes, and unfortunately, it's unbrotherly conduct. So just kind of lately, I will portray this as best as I understand history of Universal Co-Masonry. I'd like to say that, the history of Universal Co-Masonry. So the ancient mystery school, there is several camps of Masonry. When it comes to what brothers Freemasonry is going to help some say it's from the building, which is usually under more male Catholics. They tend to use that. But if you look at ritual and you follow the traditions, so the ancient mystery there is several camps of Masonry. When it comes to what brothers hear us talk a lot about Greece and Rome, it's not so much about Eastern classics and traditions, because as we'll see in the Western Eastern tradition, the current inclination is maybe two inclinations back, if you will, Freemasonry. But if you look at ritual and you follow the traditions, and so that's why we're going to talk a lot about those particular schools. You will not hear me talk about Eastern, but it's not that it's not because we know everything in the body is connected. Even if we don't listen to the Western traditions or understand those traditions, we know that Greece, many Greek and Roman philosophers and theologians impacted by, and so that's why having traveled and being a part of those philosophies. You will not hear me talk about Eastern, but Greece and Roman. So we're not going to talk about them. They're just, keep that in mind. So when we look at the ancient mystery schools, the one thing that I would tell people that may not know anything about is that it's impacted very much ritual. It's trying to get to the understand Freemasonry. It's trying to get you to understand the existential questions that plague any truly thinking Greek, my origin and my destiny. We're not going to talk about them. They're humanity stuff. Keep that in humanity stuff. So when we look at the ancient mystery, we look at those questions. I would tell people they're very, I don't want to say they're impossible to understand, but they're definitely very much in our understanding. We step into it, and then we have to grow the understanding as we gain more knowledge of what does it even mean to be thinking? What does it mean to be human being or spiritual? What are the great existential questions? And what ritual does is it works on their material form. I don't want to say there's an impact to the soul, into understanding the origin and destiny. I will not say that, I came into Freemasonry and Masonry said, we came from X and we are going to Y. That's not how it works. Freemasonry, as much as it is designed for certain people, because we are a theosophical, dogmatic Freemasonry compared to those who are dogmatic, maybe Christian or Jewish in descent, and require their members to be Christian or Jewish. We are not that. We are dogmatic, which means we sit in lodge with various amounts of people with all different beliefs systems. So if we look at Freemasonry being dogmatic and having a wide belief system, Freemasonry has to be able to touch not only, when I say the heart and mind, I kind of mean the same thing, because I'm not talking about the physical brain. I'm talking about that which is intangible. Freemasonry touches that through ritual. And so when we look at the ancient mystery schools, you will see in our rituals, if you take the time to study them, key parts from various traditions, such as the Mithras tradition. You're seeing, as mentioned, the Egyptian rites. You'll see the Dionysian mysteries. You'll see a lot of different things that are in there as they have evolved through time. So Freemasonry takes the most ancient mysteries that we know of on record in the Western philosophy and has carried them through the ancient time, through the Gilding Ages, and into the modern era. And the unfortunate thing is many of our contemporaries in Freemasonry don't realize the treasure house that they sit on when it comes to just the magnificent history and ritual that Freemasonry is. It has devolved into more of a social club or a philanthropic club. And Masonry is not that. Masonry is a ritualistic, transformative experience. It is a lifestyle, because once you see, you can't unsee. And so Freemasonry tries to help you lift the veil of ignorance and pierce into the unknown to see things that maybe you wouldn't have seen by yourself. And the ancient mysteries help us get that starting point in our rituals. So you'll see a lot, especially for those who decide to, they want to be a Mason and they're accepted and they go through the initiation. It's vastly different than, I would say, any other ritualistic experience that you can have. It hits you on many different places. So talking about the Western esoteric tradition, I'll just pull them up here really quick. There are three sciences and 4 traditions themselves. The key word that I would use with Freemasonry is that it's syncretic. And syncretic means that it has the birthplace that it has come out of, which is Greece and Rome, is that it's going to start pulling from different parts and different traditions. And it creates its own being. So just like mom and dad come together to create the child is not a clone of either parent, but an amalgamation of traits. And if you believe in cellular memory, it may be that, it's much more than just a clone. And the child is syncretic. It's going to be parts and pieces of their parents and their own self coming through that. And Freemasonry is very much syncretic. So you'll see that there are many people who enjoy Hermeticism. They enjoy Neoplatonism. They enjoy Gnosticism or Kabbalah, and they can experience it through Masonry without any difficulty, even though they're seeing it maybe from different perspectives. If you are very new to Freemasonry, and you would like a book, and I'll ask Brother Patrick to throw this in the chat, The Kabbalion by the 3 Initiates is a great place to start. It's a Hermetic read. It's short. It's brief, and I would recommend reading it multiple times, not just one. And it pulls from the Emerald Tablet, which helps us understand Hermetic laws in the modern tongue. If you ever try to read like the Divine Poimander or anything that comes from the Emerald Tablet, it's very difficult. Not that it's not undoable, but you can do it. It's just difficult. But the 3 Initiates, which is a pseudonym for an author in the 1900s, has broke it down so that the 7 principles are better understanding to the modern mind. And some of those principles in Hermeticism are going to be the law of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, as without. that's one of the laws. You have the law of gender. When we talk about gender, we're not talking about the social phenomenon we're seeing now. We're talking about the spiritual law of gender, which is the creating forces of masculine and feminine, and what those mean in creation, and what that means in the spirit or the soul, however you define it. And there's lots of polarity and all sorts of duality. You can read it. I would highly recommend it. It's a great place to start. Freemasonry has aspects of Hermeticism in there. And that's why I recommend it to you, because there's a lot of discussion about correspondence. We look to nature to help us understand what Masonry is trying to get us to understand. And so Hermeticism helps us understand what nature is so that we can understand the secrets that may be beyond our understanding. Neoplatonism is from Plotinus, that comes in the 3rd century. He revived Platonicism or Plato. So if you're interested in that would be the archetypes and the forms, the realm of forms. I would highly look into those things. Freemasonry talks a lot about the good, the true, and the beautiful. What is the good? What is the true? And what is the beautiful? And if we really want to go back into our history and understand where this is coming from, that context that Freemasonry is in, the good and the true and the beautiful are not, the modern definitions we see today. They're archetypes. There's goodness, trueness, beautifulness, ness meaning in Greek, the essence of a thing. And they're archetypes. And so you'll see in that Freemasonry, there's a lot of archetypes. Gnosticism, you see the discussion of matter. When you look at Gnostics, they don't have a very good perception of matter, in the sense that matter is keeping the divine spark that each one of us has trapped and won't release it back to the source. And so Gnosticism talks about how we're trying to get out of matter and ascend back to the monad, or back to wherever we came from. That's Gnosticism. You have Kabbalah, depending on how you pronounce it, tree of life, and how to walk the life of a Mason through the eyes of a very mystical Jewish perception. That's also a Masonry. When we look at all of this, these 4 traditions, Masonry is the 5th tradition. So it's going to have aspects, but there's something very specific to it that makes it unique, and that's ritual. When you look at taking the ancient mystery schools and tying it together with the other 4 traditions in the Western esoteric tradition, you get something very bold and very new and very different. The other part that we have that are prevalent in the other ones as well, the other traditions, are the occult sciences. When we talk about astrology, remember that we can't see it from today's perspective. We have to take it back in time, and we have to see that astrology also includes astronomy. It's not that horoscopy experience you get at the checkout counter when you want to see how much money you're going to make on a given day. Astrology has to do with influences of matter acting upon matter, and how it has, how it can provide a prediction of patterns based off of patterns. So it's much more than what it has been degraded into, frankly, today. So astrology is a part of it. We look at alchemy. We can spend multiple series talking about it. Alchemy, looking at the transmutation, taking the philosopher's stone and trying to achieve it. Looking at the elixir of life, there are 2 different things. How does alchemy help us go from our base material, that prima materia, and go into the highest form of gold that we can be? And what are the steps that do it? Freemasonry has that in there. And then ceremonial magic. I'm not talking about magic in the hokey sense or in the weird, like voodoo sense. I'm talking about the magic of change. When you are inspired to make changes in your life because of rituals that you have done, that's ceremonial magic. And Freemasonry is very much, that's where I would say it sits the most. It has a ceremonial influence that inspires its initiate to change. So Freemasonry is going to come out of the Western esoteric tradition. It's going to be born in this, and it's going to give you a good idea of just how do we take the ancient mysteries, how do we take the other traditions, and how do we fuse it together and send it into the Gilding Ages. So already we're like 3 slides deep, and we can see how complex this is. And that's why it's a brief history. There's lots of different places if you want to fall down a rabbit hole that you can go that would bring some really good insight into what Freemasonry is. So from the ancient mysteries of Greece, Rome, and Egypt, we move into the Hellenistic period, where we see Greece and Egypt coming together to be the bedrock and birthplace of the 5 traditions, again, Freemasonry, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, as well as the 3 occult sciences coming together. Unfortunately, if you were to look at the ancient mystery schools and to see when they kind of dropped off on the historical time frame, this would have to do in 381, and this has to do with Theodosius I. And you will see that Theodosius I, he was a co-emperor of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So we're starting to see Rome fall apart, which will fall apart a little bit later into the early 5th century, 400s. You'll see that Theodosius comes out the first and says that it is prohibited by pain of death if you practice any of the pagan religion or pagan mystery schools. And so if you map out all the ancient mystery schools on the timeline, which me and another brother did many years ago, it's very interesting. You'll see a very stark drop off where the ancient mysteries don't continue on. And it's right here with Theodosius I. In 392, he became emperor of the whole entire empire. And he would be the last one to actually be the final emperor of the Roman Empire before it completely fell apart. And it would be until his reign in 395 that the pagans, as they called them, would be persecuted, and then they would be destroyed. So what we saw is that he would suppress even the Olympic Games were suppressed. He did that in 393. He did a lot to really shape the face of theology and philosophy in the Roman Empire, to bring it more into a Christian perspective. Now, a lot of the mystery schools, I want to say a lot, I don't know if it's a lot, I can't say that. Several of the mystery schools were completely exterminated. They were eradicated off the face of the earth. And the reason why I say that is because we can't find anything historically or archaeologically that would tell us that they went underground, but there were some that went underground. The Gnostics, mystic Christianity went underground. A few of them survived, but they had to be very careful, else they would be persecuted and brought to death. So many of them, the ancient mysteries, were terminated under Theodosius I. And you can read more about him if you'd like, but we would see that Freemasonry would go underground with Gnosticism and also go above ground with the building guilds. It kind of went it bifurcated into 2 different places. And so you'll see that a lot of time will pass, over 1,000 years, where we really don't see a lot going on in history with Freemasonry or the Western esoteric tradition. There are some manuscripts, the Halliwell manuscript. There's one in, I believe that's the one in, I'm terrible with dates, so 785, I want to say. Don't quote me on that. Don't write that down. Go look it up and prove me wrong. That it's somewhere in the medieval times, the Middle Ages, that there was a manuscript, the Halliwell manuscript, where they had women that were listed on the rosters of the building guilds. So there is that manuscript, but it would be the 1425, the Regius manuscript, that would really start to bring Freemasonry up through its underground hibernation, if you will. And the Regius manuscript was really, really interesting because it's one of the oldest Masonic documents that we have on file that we can find. And it sets the tenets of Freemasonry. It tells a Mason how to behave, how to act in certain situations. It gives it a moral code. And so we start to see that this document starts to be concretizing Freemasonry, which for 1,000 years, roughly, we hadn't heard anything about it. So it was always there, but this is the first document. 1598, a little over 150 years later, we'll see that we have the first Masonic Lodge, which is the Lodge of Edinburgh, and it's still today. You can go visit it if you want. It's the first Masonic Lodge on record that we have minutes for, and that we have the building still standing. So we kind of see our own dark ages where we go quiet for 1,000 years, and then we kind of start to peek our head up from the sand and start to reemerge onto the surface when it's a little more safe. But we're not the same. We're not the we're not going to be the exact incarnation that we were when we were brought underground by Theodosius I. So we're going to see that it's kind of like a chrysalis in some sense, that we started to metamorphosize into something new. I want to stop here. We're not at the end of our early modern era, but I do want to see if there are any questions, if there are any comments, something I missed that someone would like to add in from anyone in the group. So if you have a question or comment, please take a moment, raise your hand, and we will get you unmuted. And we would love to hear your thoughts or comments before we get into early modern era. All right. With no hands raised, let us move forward. So we're going to see the spreading of Freemasonry starting in 1717. So you have the Lodge of Edinburgh, which was in 1598, and it wouldn't be until 1717 that we actually see a Grand Lodge form, which is going to be the premier Grand Lodge of England, which is the precursor to the United Grand Lodge of England. There's a lot that happened. We're quiet for 1,000 years, and then like a span of 300 years, we have a lot going on. And maybe that's just because we have recorded history a little bit better, but there seems to be a lot of movement. Now, the reason why I titled this slide, the spreading of Freemasonry, is that image is actually called the teaching the people. Is it the teaching the people of Freemasonry?
Freemasonry
teaching the people. Freemasonry teaching the people. So this is, if you ever want to sit there and just meditate on a lot of symbols, I would highly recommend this particular artwork. It's very, very beautiful and very, very poignant in what it's trying to convey about Masonry. 1717, you have the drafting of Anderson's constitutions. You have the formation. Anderson constitutions, I've heard 1717. I've also heard 1723. I don't think it really matters what date, but it is roughly at this time where 4 lodges, Masonic lodges, got together and said, hey, let's form a big Grand Lodge, and we'll call it a Grand Lodge. And the 4 of us, so these 4 lodges will make the Grand Lodge, and we'll call it the Premier Grand Lodge of England. So we're seeing it. We've moved from Rome and Greece and Egypt. We've moved up into Europe, the upper part of Europe, I should say, into England. And we'll see that the landscape for the next 200 years or 150 years is going to be between England and France. Kind of goes back and forth. You have English Masonry and you have Continental Masonry, and that's where you kind of get the distinction between the two. But the Premier Grand Lodge of England, 1717, and what happens is from there you get the Grand Lodge of France, which is going to happen in 1728. So the Grand Lodge of France is going to come out of the Premier Grand Lodge of England. You will see that Freemasonry burns through Europe very quickly, very quickly. And I mentioned this book. It's by Francis Yates, and if you could throw it in there, Brother Patrick, it's The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. I mentioned this book, I think several seminars back, maybe last time, I don't remember. It's one of the books that I thought was most pivotal in my personal growth of understanding history from an occult and esoteric standpoint. It was interesting to read about Freemasonry, being a Freemason. There's some things I agreed with Francis Yates, if I could be so bold to say that. She's a renowned historian, or she was a renowned historian. But I found her storytelling of the history of Europe during the 1700s, 1800s, and a little bit before, very, very fascinating. You have to remember that the landscape at the time, the backdrop in which Freemasonry is reemerging out of the ground is, 1700s. Europe it's always been very tumultuous. You have a lot of there's a lot of fighting between Catholic and Protestants. It's very, people have affiliations with one group or the other, and it's a lot of bloodshed. So it's a great upheaval. And that's just making it, very glossy on the surface. There's a lot of tumult and a lot of people wanting to see peace from, I don't necessarily think from a royal standpoint, but more from the peasants that lived in the country. They didn't like this experience of constant bloodshed, and they believed in the esoteric. And so you'll see wonderful figures starting to crop out that really help bring esotericism to the front. You start to see occultism brought to the front. Now, when I use, just as a side note, when I use the word esotericism, I'm saying information for the few, and I'm using it in the sense of mystical information for the few, if you will. And when I use the word occult, it means that it's hidden. So it's not just laying out on the front and anyone can pick it up and see it. It's something you have to work for. And so you'll see that you'll have the manifestos come out in the late 1500s, early 1600s that caused this foray across Europe where people are just, the Illuminati come out at this point. The Bavarian Illuminati don't last very long. So if anyone tries to get you to go to the Illuminati, I'd be very careful. You might be scammed. You have the Illuminati come out for a brief instant in time. You have all these groups, Christian Rosenkrauts, the Rosicrucians coming in, lots of groups that really are, they're very spiritual. A lot of them are very Christian in the traditional sense of, Catholic, some of them going into the Protestant vein. So there's a mystical Christianity that this is laying underneath the birth of Freemasonry. So we'll see that the premier Grand Lodge of England is coming out of that very tumultuous time into still tumultuous, but not as much. And then from there, once this English Masonry starts to spread, it goes to France. And so you see in 1728 that you have this, that Masonry moves into the French era. And if you ever have met English people and Frenchmen, they like to fight. Even though there's a small channel that brings them, that separates them, they very much like to do things their own way. So with anything in evolution, if you see a bifurcation like that, you're going to see changes in ritual, changes in the way things are done. English tried to inspire by words in the sense of moral contact and rectitude. French are a little more fiery than our English counterparts. They're more into social reform and taking care of the state or the country and seeing it do best by its people. So you have a lot of differences coming in with the Grand Lodge of France. And then you have the Grand Lodge, the Grand Orient of France, and that's going to be in 1773. So from the Premier Grand Lodge, you have the Grand Lodge of France, and then you have the Grand Orient of France. And then you're going to see the Premier Grand Lodge had split back in the day because they were fighting over, you have the ancients and the moderns fighting over how many degrees were in Masonry. So you'll see the Premier split based on whether you believe there was only 3 degrees in Masonry or you believed that the HRA or the Holy Royal Arch of Jerusalem, if that was a part of it, they split, and for not 100 years, but close. For 96 years, they remained separate. So in 1813, they got together and they were able to find a treat. They found a common ground and they came together, and that's where we get the Grand Lodge of the United Grand Lodge of England. And that's when they said there's only 3 degrees in Masonry plus the HRA. So a little bit of wordsmith brought the two sides together and created the United Grand Lodge of England, which is the most well-known Grand Lodge in the world. And that's all men. And it's all over in almost every single country. So you start to see that there's this spreading. Now, here's where we start to see Universal Co-Masonry is coming out of this, because we come through the vein of the Grand Orient de France from the United Grand Lodge of France back into the Premier. So that's kind of the vein, just to keep in mind where we're coming from. And we're going to go about 2 more, this slide and the next one, and we'll stop for comments and questions. So what happened is that the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Orient de France, they got along just fine for a while. But then they had 2 points that caused the ultimate. They had a point in 1869 that started the schism, that started the break between the two. And then you have one that is in 1877 that finalizes it. So a little under 10 years, you'll see that the United Grand Lodge of England and the good relations with the Grand Orient de France break and crumble. So here, there's the one on the left, the paragraph on the left talks about that first initial point that caused the schism. And that comes from the fact that the Grand Orient de France, recognized a Masonic group in Louisiana. So by this time, we have Masonry that's come to North America, specifically the United States. And the Grand Orient de France recognized a Masonic group that was in Louisiana that was not recognized by the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. And the Grand Lodge of Louisiana is under the banner of the United Grand Lodge of England. So that's the connection there. Well, this recognition by the Grand Orient de France really really upset the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. They felt that the Grand Orient de France had overstepped their jurisdiction, that they had no right to do that. And so the Grand Lodge of Louisiana asked several surrounding Grand Lodges in the United States to unrecognize the Grand Orient de France. And this had to do with some racial motivations. For those who are not familiar with the United States, our southern states tend to have some bigotry based on racial lines. Freemasonry, unfortunately, has it in its history, and it still does. There's some lodges, Grand Lodges, that don't accept Black Americans for whatever the reasons are. I mean, they definitely don't accept women, but they don't accept Black Americans. And that's where you'll see Prince Hall, who was made a Mason. He's a Black gentleman that was made a Mason. And then during the Civil War, wasn't it?
American Revolution.
American Revolution, thank you. He was a Mason and was made a Mason during the American Revolutionary War. And then after the war, the Grand Lodge recanted and said, nope, you're not a Mason anymore. And so he went and formed the Black American Masonry, which is Prince Hall Masonry. And so you see that even today in our modern world, we still have racial tensions, even amongst Freemasons, which is most unfortunate. And something that Universal Co-Masonry doesn't share, which we'll see here in a minute. So in 1869, we see that the Grand Orient de France and the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, they have that tension, and it starts to see excuse my language, it's crude, but it really fits it. It's a pissing match of recognition, who's going to be recognizing who. And so you see that on both sides, people start, unrecognizing each other as, legitimate Masons, even though a year before they were considered legitimate Masons. So it was political. And then you see in 1877 that the Grand Orient de France, they secularized the requirement of the belief in God, which Universal Co-Masonry does not share. So the Grand Orient de France said, you don't have to believe in a being. They secularized it. They said, you don't have to believe in an entity that's higher than you at all to be a Freemason, which, for those who are familiar with our landmarks, which are our goalposts that say this is what Freemasonry is, one of the landmarks that's written by Mackey says that you have to believe in a divine entity or a divine power. He specifically says divine being. So this flies in the face of the United Grand Lodge. And then this ultimately breaks the connection between the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Orient de France. So that's where the schism happens between English Masonry and Continental Masonry. And so you see that there's, again, a dichotomous points moving forward parallel in history as we start to understand why, maybe French Masons don't necessarily recognize English Masons and vice versa. So I want to stop here because we are at the next part and see if there are any questions, any comments, anything that brothers who would like to add to what I've said, because I've said a lot, and as if there's anything that needs clarification. Victor, Matthias, you're not Matthias, but Brother Patrick will go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Victor. Cannot hear you though. I don't know if that's me. Hold on. I think that's me. So we're just going to fix something here. My thing's right there. Okay. Victor, can you try again and see if I can fix my volume? No, let me see if I just muted down here. Can you all hear him okay? And is it just me? No, no one can hear him. Okay. So Victor, no, okay, that makes me feel better. It means it's not on my end. Victor, we can't hear you. So I don't know if you want to try and plug in your headset. There you go. No, we can't hear you. We'll go to Brother Cat and then we'll come back to you and let's see if we can hear you. Brother Cat.
Yes, Brother Katie, thank you. One of the things that I found interesting was reading an article on the Universal Co-Masonry, an old article on the Universal Co-Masonry site that talked about landmarks and the changing thereof. right? That a Grand Lodge or Supreme Council does in fact have the right to make alterations, and that this has in fact happened in the past. So, for example, in the United States of America, there were several lodges that had a requirement that you had to be born free to be a Mason, and that you had to be of perfect body to be a Mason. And then after the Civil War, these lodges who wanted to admit men who had been slaves previously or veterans who had lost a limb during the Civil War, they weren't able to do so until those particular landmarks were changed. And it's interesting to see how the landmarks kind of go out and then come back again. So like you point out, the Grand Orient of France said, okay, it's totally secular. It's completely up to the conscience of any particular brother as to whether they believe in God or not. And then Co-Masonry, as a descendant of the Grand Orient of France, has come back to the idea of, no, we really do need to be cognizant of a greater being, because otherwise the stuff that we're doing doesn't really make sense.
Thank you, Brother Kat. To your point about the landmarks changing, it's interesting because there's a landmark saying you can't write the landmarks down. So it creates this weird conundrum, because it's like, well, if you write them down, then they're concretized. It become kind of like the 10 Commandments. But there's a landmark saying you can't write it down and you can't change them. So there's this place of ambiguity, which it doesn't bother me in the slightest that it exists, because there's definitely things that Freemasonry is not. And there's definitely landmarks that are made by men. And I think when you look at landmarks, they're extremely crucial in demarcating where one entity ends and another begins. Freemasonry isn't whatever you want it to be. Freemasonry definitely stands for many, many things. And if you remove those landmarks, it stops being Freemasonry. The question is, which landmark are those? And I think, over my few years in Masonry, like you can see those obediences that are definitely truer to what Freemasonry, the spirit of Freemasonry, and those who are furthest away. It's like a gradient. But there are, all Masonic obediences are not the same, because the landmarks are going to be different. When we talk about the government of the craft, which is next month, we'll be talking about the landmarks. We'll be looking at what makes Freemasonry versus some other ritualistic esoteric group. Like, why is it not Theosophy? Or why is it not, the liberal Catholic Church or some other esoteric group? What makes Freemasonry Freemasonry? It's an excellent point. Thank you for that, Brother Kat. Victor, did you get your volume mic fixed? Hold on, we're unmuting you. We're just waiting 1 second. And if you see me looking off to the side, it's because my computer's off to the side. I'm not staring at something else. Can you get him unmuted? Okay, Victor, try us. Yeah, there you are.
Can you hear my voice? Good.
Yeah.
Hold on, I'm sorry. I got a pop. Can I be, I'm in a dormitory. Okay. But to not be distracted. Interestingly, brothers, I'm looking at, after and while I'm listening and learning a lot, history. And as you can tell, I'm as well, I'm a member of 530 Kappa, right? And so I've studied a lot about the World War II area or time period, the 20th century. And so I wish that in general we could spend time off and on between historic passages, if you will, to dwell in the modern spectrum of where we are in philosophy, but with regard to modern Masonic intercourse and where we are with the hardship that was mentioned in the introduction this evening concerning Co-Masonry, how much with the impact of theosophy, kind of versing philosophy that has had to be dealt with, because these lodges in rural areas have had to shut down. These are causes from the World War that we're, I think are part of the struggles and a part of the commendation that is due Co-Masonry, because it's not just history and like the confounding points that are mysteries. It's the phenomena, that we are just currently going through in life. And so it's been a point in time when talking about France, when, with the war and everything, dues couldn't be paid, members couldn't attend for that. The more wealthy theosophists became, a greater and greater share of the membership, which slowly started to erode the balance. And so many benevolent, innocent attempts we've made, but our society structure, so to speak, constraints, etc., have as well contributed to this struggle and this continuous thrive to this history, these historic landmarks and things like that. I would like to hope that we are visiting the current ways that we make lessons of Freemasonry applicable to and becoming a better leader, and having took some ethnomethodological or ethnographic endeavors along the way. To do that, it's going to be, it's not going to get easier for people who underestimate Co-Masonry if they don't understand how well collaborated it is along with its historic context, so to speak. And talk a little bit more current times. That's all.
Thank you, Victor. So we are going to actually talk a little bit about, not a little bit, quite a bit about theosophy here. And as we start to go into the early modern era and the modern era, we will see that the history of Universal Co-Masonry is intricately tied to theosophy, with one of the head of our orders being Annie Besant, who was one of the most prominent outside of Blavatsky herself, one of the most well-known theosophists, and she was a Freemason. And we're actually going in that direction. So hopefully we can talk more about that in depth. Just watching my time here, making sure that I respect it and we can make some progress. We're going to see that there is a huge impact about what Freemasonry, where it has come from. It's like, if you take Freemasonry and make it, humanize it and say it's a person, it has a birthplace, it has a parent, it has a childhood, it has teenage years, it's growing up. And so as we give it context of how it's grown up, it helps us to better understand the destiny itself of what Co-Masonry is, or what Freemasonry will be. And hopefully I can illustrate that point as we move forward. As there are no other comments or questions, the one thing I want to talk about before we get to the actual earlier part that sets the stage for theosophy a little bit. We have two chief people at the end of the 19th century that have a massive impact. Without them, we would not have mixed masonry, as it was called abroad, Co-Masonry, as it's called domestically in the United States, and that's Maria Durand, and that's George Martin and his wife. These three people, his wife was, what's her name?
Maria Martin.
Yeah, so Maria Martin and Maria Durand. So we see these three individuals having a massive impact. So what happened is that you'll see on the right, you have Maria Durand, who was born in 1828, who would become a Mason herself. She was initiated in Les Libres Penseurs Lodge, and that's on the outskirts of Paris, and that was in 1882. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't like she was looking and she shouldn't have been, and they had to initiate her. She was initiated as a individual, as a woman. Now, this is in context that you're starting to see that universal suffrage is happening in 1848 is the starting point. So this isn't something that's brand new, women coming into their own understanding of themselves and where they are on the social playing field. So her coming in she would become a Mason, and she would help create what would be known as Le Ghanian. And that is coming out of the Grand Orient de France, the Le Ghanian. And so between George Martin and Maria Durem, you'll see that they will create a constitution, and they'll call the first lodge of that constitution Le Ghanian, or the human right. And from there, they'll start initiating many prominent people, which brings us into the birth of the Le Ghanian, which is it's mixed masonry. When Freemasonry or mixed masonry came to the United States at the time, this is just an interesting side comment. The head of our order, as it was back in the early 1900s, was talking to Annie Besant, brother Annie Besant, and said, they were trying to find a name that would be appropriate for the United States, and they wanted mixed masonry. And Brother Louis Wazoo was like, we can't call it that. Mixed masonry has a very negative pejorative in the United States. It has something to do with brothels, if you will, and saloons. And so they had to come up with a different name. And that's why you see in the United States that we are co-masons versus mixed masons, because the connotation at the time, just a side historical trivial fact, if you want to know why we're not called mixed masons. So in 1893, we'll see that George Martin and his wife Maria Martin and Maria Durem will create the first constitution that would be the birth of the Ghanian. And this is the Grand Lodge, symbolic, is the Grand Lodge that they formed, the constitution they formed it for, and then the first lodge that was under it that had men and women, so it was mixed, would be called Le Ghanian. Now, over time, it just became known as Le Ghanian, or the human right. Maria Durem was very interesting because when she was initiated, she was able to bring in, to pave the way for some very important individuals outside of herself, And the first one to mention is Brother Annie Besant, or some people call her Annie Besant. I've never got a conclusive pronunciation on her name. She would pave the way for Brother Besant to become a Mason herself. But it wasn't that it was Maria Durem individually that brought Annie Besant in. It was actually a woman named Francesca Arundel. And her husband were Freemasons. What's husband's name?
George Arundel.
George and Maria. George Arundel, married to George Arundel. And so they were very prominent Theosophists. They were very prominent in Freemasonry. And Annie Besant would join the Theosophical Society, and would be, when she met Francesca Arundel in the Theosophical Society, that Freemasonry came up. And it was through her that Annie Besant would be initiated, passed, and raised. It was her invitation that brought her back to Paris, along with 6 other friends. And they were all initiated, passed, and raised in Emulation Lodge number 6. And I said France, it should be England, back in London at that time. So Annie Besant is a very fascinating individual. I have met many people who love her and some who do not care for her and her history. But putting our individual opinions aside, looking at her as a historical individual, she was a giant. She knew Mahatma Gandhi. Like she wasn't a small stone. Like, she definitely was a massive player in bringing women specifically into Freemasonry. And she worked very hard in Masonry. She believed in it, and she advanced to the 33rd degree, which is the highest and last degree you can get in Masonry. And she became the most puissant Grand Commander at the time. And here at the general office here at Universal Co-Masonry, we actually do have some of her ashes in our library that people, whoever comes and visits, can actually go and see, because she is so important to us. I think that's an amazing piece of thought form to keep with us in our experience in Universal Co-Masonry. So this is what Brother Annie Besant said when she was talking about women and men in Freemasonry. She said, and I'm reading the quote at the bottom, she says, "Co-Masonry has arisen from the bosom of masculine masonry in order to bring women into that ancient fraternity on exactly the same terms as men, and thus to restore the whole brotherhood to the position from which it fell when it broke its link with the ancient mysteries by excluding women from its ranks." I think this is an extremely important quote. One, because a lot of people will say, well, in the ancient mysteries, it was just men. Well, Pythagoras' school, the Pythagoreans, they had women. Pythagoras' wife and daughter was a part of his school. So we do know, like, when we look at the cult of Mithras, that was for Roman soldiers. So you wouldn't see women in the cult of Mithras, but you would see them in other ancient mystery schools. And when we look at this, at some point, when we go back to that ancient heritage, where women were not in every facet, but they were in parts of the ancient mysteries schools, we see that they were no longer accepted. And we see that they were brought out of Freemasonry, brought out of the mystery schools. And Annie Besant wanted to see a restoration of that, to see that men and women were equals. And again, another, at least I find interesting, historical tidbit about the term brother. If you notice, I've been talking to Brother Patrick, and he calls me Brother Katie. Brother, there's some contention of why we're not brothers and sisters. Why aren't we go by different names? I know there is a member of ours who's actually working on a book of sex, gender, theosophy, and Universal Co-Masonry, which is fascinating when it gets published. I would recommend it when it comes out. But in the historical delve, we learned that there, in our documents, we have times where Annie Besant was called sister, and then there was a time that she went to brother, and there was no direct edict saying that we had to be brothers, but it did come out that the women made the decision in the order to go by brother. It wasn't a masculine move to make everyone brother. It was the women who opted to change from sister to brother. And to this day, we hold to that tradition that every member, independent of biological sex, is called brother. And coming from a tradition that went by sister, I actually find it something that is very, I don't want to say, what would be the word? Very empowering, very beautiful, very, there's something that I find it very spiritual, because it puts us all on the same playing board in Freemasonry. And it was actually through Annie Besant and her time as most Besant Grand Commander that she would have that change in our documents. And you can, Brother Patrick is our Grand Archivist and Librarian here at the General Office, and you can ask to see those documents, and you can look at them yourself and see how that change was actually something that was put on by the women and not by the men. Again, side historical fact, but I thought that would be interesting. Annie Besant, she was a huge activist for Freemasonry, a huge activist for women, but it wasn't to demasculate men. It wasn't to put women where they didn't belong, but it was a restoration that, in order, if you go back to that hermetic principle that I was talking about an hour ago, that when we look at creation, when we look at creating transformation, using ceremonial magic, using things that help make the spirit better than what it thinks it can be, because it looks at itself through material eyes, you need both masculine and feminine creative forces. And so when we look at Universal Co-Masonry, I have sat in meetings where it's predominantly women, and it feels very different when it's men and women, and when it's equal men and women. They have different feelings and energies and vibrations that go with that. And I would say personally, I enjoy it when you have men and women present in, I wouldn't say equal form, but definitely, it's not one man to 10 women, but there is a good representation from both groups. It provides a different type of energy that's very stabilizing, that allows the ritual to do what it needs to do for that day's work. It would be Annie Besant, who worked very, very hard to do that restoration of women back into the ancient mysteries. Now, when we look at Universal Co-Masonry, it is not a platform for any social movement. It's not like today we're on the fourth or fifth wave of feminism. You don't see that as like this banner that we fly behind our buildings and in our lodges. It's just a part of our history that made us who we are. Freemasonry stands alone on its own merits and its own credentials, and does not use itself for any other platform but Masonic work and working for the betterment of humanity under the auspices of the great architect. So that creative principle that created all, however you want to define it. Annie Besant, very prominent, obviously a theosophist. For those who may not know who she is, I would recommend you look into her as a historical figure if you want to know more about her. Very prominent in Adyar, India, where the Theosophical Society had its main headquarters, still has its main headquarters. Very, very prominent person. So we're starting to get into a little bit of living history. In 1903, so we have a gentleman named Antoine Muzzarelli. Sounds Italian. He is Italian, but he comes from France. He's going to be a French journalist that comes over to the United States, and he is of the Le Droit Humain. He was a representative that came over, and he wanted to instill mixed masonry in the United States. And I want you to keep in mind what's going on in the 1900s, early 1900s. Try to keep that landscape going to see what it was like when you have this French journalist coming in and wanting to terraform, Masoniform, I guess you want to say. Can I use that word? I made that word up. Give me credit. Masoniform the United States, and create a mixed masonry in the United States that still had that heritage. That was the Grand Orient de France. That was the Grand Lodge of France that went back to the United Grand Lodge of England. So there's that, again, that pedigree that's coming through that Le Droit Humain carried. Interestingly enough about Antoine Muzzarelli is that we did not know about him in our history books until, like 10 years ago?
10, 15.
Yeah, like 10 or 15 years ago. We have a place where we keep all of our documents. I like to call it the Masonic Room of Requirement. Is that what's called? In Harry Potter? The room, is that what it is?
The room of requirement.
Yeah. Okay, make sure I'm saying that right. I call it the Masonic Room of Requirement because it seems like when you ask for something, it kind of appears. And I wasn't there, but some brothers were working in that space trying to find some stuff, and they found some documents that was previously unknown to us that talked about Antoine Muzzarelli and how he actually, along with our next person, which is Louis Wazoo, founded American Co-Masonry, as we were called back in the day, American Co-Masonry, which was the American Federation of Le Droit Humain. So let me just kind of break down what I said, because that was a lot. So Le Droit Humain became international, and it had federations by country. So you had all different, depending on the country, that was what the federation was called. So we had, in the United States, it was called the American Federation of the Le Droit Humain. So we were the American version of what, the Le Droit Humain stood for in Paris. Paris was the capital of Le Droit Humain. So we didn't know that Antoine Muzzarelli was a part of that history until about 10, 15 years ago when we found his documents in that space for the Room of Requirement many, many years ago. And that was in my living history. I actually was there when they came out. I was like, we found these documents. This is crazy. And we wanted him written in our history books, of which we do have a history written by one of our brothers, Brother Karen Kidd. It's called On Holy Ground. And it talks about this early modern era moving forward. And Antoine Muzzarelli, the reason why we think that he was not really brought forward in the historical memory for its members is because he committed suicide, unfortunately, in 1908. He had found that some of the degrees he had received from another obedience in Masonry were not valid, and he truly believed in Masonry and could not bear that his degrees were not legitimate, and he committed suicide. He had breakfast with some friends one morning, and afterwards he went upstairs. He lived above the restaurant, if I remember correctly, and he committed suicide. And so we believe that, we postulate that that's probably the reason why he wasn't really brought forward. A very unpleasant part of our history, but it is a man's life, and a very noble man who brought Freemasonry forward into the United States from Paris. He, Brother Antoine Muzzarelli, worked with Louis Wazoo, who's also a Frenchman. It's not Gazoo, as many people like to pronounce. Louis Wazoo was a French gentleman. He was really big into minors' rights in the United States. When he came over, he came over from France, came to the United States, ended up in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, and he was approached by Antoine Muzzarelli and said, "Hey, I have this amazing thing called mixed Freemasonry. I think you should help me. Let's start this together." And Louis Wazoo, he even says later on, originally I joined Masonry because I wanted to use it for, he was a socialist. He wanted to use it for workers' rights, and he wanted to see miners get, the environment, the safe environment that they needed, and the wages and all that stuff that he believed that was fair to them. And before he died, he said, I went into to change Masonry and Masonry changed me. And he would actually end up being what we all know as our founder of American Co-Masonry / Universal Co-Masonry, although it was Antoine Muzzarelli that pushed him in the right direction. He worked very, very hard. He opened many lodges. He was a huge human activist of his time. And he was beloved. He was very, very beloved by all those who knew him. He would go on lectures tours around the United States, and he would promote Freemasonry. And we saw a big boom of mixed Masonry in the United States underneath Louis Wazou's leadership and tenure. He would pass away. He was very beloved, and it was a well-attended funeral memorial service for him. He would become the most puissant Grand Commander, Louis Wazou. And then you would see in 1937 a woman named Edith Armour, who would step in after Louis Wazou came in. When we call someone the most puissant Grand Commander, that is the head of the federation of that country. So you have the most sovereign Grand Commander in France that oversees all of the international lodges across the world. That's under the umbrella of Le Droit Humain. And then each country had a most puissant, just so you understand why I use these terms so freely. So after Louis Wazou passed away, you had the next most puissant Grand Commander. That would be Edith Armour. And she was a pistol, from what I understand. She was not very tall. She was a little under 5 feet. But she was a firecracker. And she would take on the mantle of American Co-Masonry during the Great Depression, which is some of the hardest times that this country has seen. And she would also oversee the Federation, as we call it. That's our slang, the Federation, the American Federation during World War II. And when France was occupied by the Nazi Party, Le Droit Humain temporarily moved its, what's the word I want to say? Moved its
Supreme Council.
Yeah, I guess I could say it that would move the Supreme Council to the United States. We were the de facto capital until France regained its autonomy after World War II. And it did go back to Paris, but when Paris was occupied, the head of the Le Droit Humain moved to the United States until it could safely return back to its home in Paris. And Edith Armour would oversee the Great Depression, World War II, moving of the Supreme Council and the epicenter of Le Droit Humain. So she had a very important part to play, and she had a lot of weight on her shoulders. And it seemed that despite her being short, she was very mighty, and she was able to carry the just kind of like Sisyphus, and I guess that huge boulder for as long as she could. And it was during her time that you would see a huge influx of theosophical membership. In fact, there was kind of like this trifecta where you would see someone was a co-Mason, they were also a theosophist and a member of the liberal Catholic Church. They kind of came together. But it's during her time that you'd see a lot of our members would be both a Freemason and a theosophist, and that would surge. Unfortunately, the boom of Louis Wazou and Antoine Muzzarelli, where we saw this huge, influx of mixed Masonry across the United States because of the Great Depression, World War II, and the hard times that our country saw and the world saw, we saw that those lodges across the country started to close down, and we would see a kind of a depression in our membership. But because of Armour's encouragement, we saw a lot of theosophy maintain the membership of Freemasonry in American Co-Masonry. So the next part, I am going to read probably a few of these portions of the slide. It's very important. This is actually living history. We do have people in our order who still are very much alive that have experienced what we're going to talk about. And every once in a while, I'll get questions from inquirers who want to know our connection with the Le Droit Humain and why we're not still called Le Droit Humain. And so I think it's very, very important that we talk about what happened between American Co-Masonry and the Le Droit Humain. And again, American Co-Masonry is synonymous for American Federation, which is what we were called until fairly recently, actually. I'm not going to read you the whole slide, but I do think there are some key parts in here. Let me just set the stage. Louis Wazoo gave a very impressive prophecy, if you will, back in the early 1900s. So Paris, the Supreme Council in Paris of Le Droit Humain said, look, we're going to issue all of our documents in French. So all of our charters, our diplomas, all our paperwork would all be in French. And Louis Wazoo said to them, he said, look, you gotta be careful. The American spirit is very, very autonomous. They're very free flowing and independent. And if you try to put your boot on their back, if you try to force them to do something that's not an American thing to do, they're gonna revolt, and they're not gonna follow that. And he said this 100 years ago, not really knowing exactly, obviously, what would happen in the future. And to his prophecy, that did actually happen, in the sense that we start to see a tension that starts to build up between the Supreme Council in Paris of the Le Droit Humain and the American Federation membership. Some key parts in this. So we had several other most puissant Grand Commanders. I did jump from like Edith Armour. There's a whole bunch in there. And if you want to look at those, if you want to find it on the Co-Masonry, our website, if you go to our website, we actually have a list of all of our most puissant Grand Commanders. So you can look at the history if that interests you. But what would happen is that we would see that this tension between Paris and the American Federation starts to build up, and we start to see it peak when in the 1980s, we have a brother called Brother Kalahak, which unfortunately she has passed away in the last, I think, 5 years. 10 years she passed away. And she was the most puissant Grand Commander. And we have two positions that are at the head of just to kind of explain the hierarchy. You have the head of our order, which at this point is called the most puissant Grand Commander in history. And underneath you have the president. And the president is all the power that is like temporal, that deals with finances, that deals with, we have properties at the headquarters and around the world where we own buildings for lodges and stuff like that. All of the temporal and financial responsibilities of the most puissant Grand Commander are given to the president. And the president oversees the temporal affairs, and the most puissant overlooks the spiritual, ritualistic affairs. So that way you kind of keep them separated. But in the early 1980s, Brother Kalahak actually held both positions, which is not necessarily unethical. It was something that was done. So it wasn't untoward that she had both the most puissant as well as president. But Brother Hack did not take care of being a president as much as she should have. And she stepped down as president because of some unethical behavior that she exhibited, which I actually don't know the details of what that behavior was, but the membership asked her to step down, and she stepped down from president, but she kept the most puissant Grand Commander, which that position is given to you by Paris, just so you know, where the president is voted for by the membership. So she steps down as president. Brother Rosario Menocall would step in as president, and you kind of see that kind of separation. And that creates this kind of a tension, because the people of the American Federation are not very happy with leadership, with the way that Brother Kalahak did it. So tensions would continue to build as Paris started to make the Masonic philosophy more secularized, started to remove a lot of the spiritual components. Now you have to remember, a lot of our members were, not just theosophical, but they were religious. America, up until fairly recently, was a very religious country. We obviously can't make that statement today, but it was. And so having that secularization really upset the membership, and it started to cause some friction. Although it caused that friction, the members of the American Federation would still continue to support the Supreme Council, because they did believe in the mission of Freemasonry. And so they tried very hard to support and be positive about the situation, even though there was a tension building. Brother Kalahak would remain most puissant Grand Commander for another 9 years, and then she would resign because she was unpopular, and that she was being accused of some unethical behavior, and there was several complaints to Paris about her. So she stepped down from the head of our federation, of our jurisdiction, in the late 1980s. So what happened next would be kind of the powder keg, not the match, but definitely the powder keg of it all. So when Brother Calahac stepped down from most puissant Grand Commander, it left a vacancy in that leadership. Now, just again, a little bit about Masonic hierarchy. The 32nds, which again is right below the highest degree, that you have to be a 33rd in order to be the head of the order. The 32nds collectively are known as the consistory, and they are a voting body. And so what the way the structure was set up is that the 32nds would vote on their top 3 candidates for the most puissant Grand Commander, and they would send that to Paris and say, by priority, this is the first pick, second pick, and third pick. And it was custom that Paris would always choose the first pick, and that person would go and receive the 33rd if they didn't have it already in Paris, and then they'd be installed in the position of the head of the American Federation. That is custom. That's what had been done since Antoine Muzzarelli and Louis Wazoo. That's not what happened though in after Brother Calahac resigned. So the 32nds rather got together, had a consistory meeting. They voted on the top 3 names, and they submitted them to Paris. The first one was Magdalena Cumcie. The second one was Brother Rosario Menacol, and the third was Brother Vera Bressler. And the tension, again, the powder keg of it all is that Brother Magdalena Cumcie, she was a 32nd. She went to Paris because she was the first pick, and she was going to receive the 33rd so they can install her as most puissant Grand Commander of the American Federation of the Le Droit Humain. And in a very unexpected turn of events, Paris said, no, you're not going to get the 33rd. She was in Paris. No, you're not going to get the 33rd. In fact, we're not even going to go with the second pick. We're going to go with the third pick, which is Brother Vera Bressler. And we don't know very much about Brother Vera Bressler, but we do know that she was in her 80s and that she was inactive in membership. Brother Magdalena Cumcie at the time was in her early 40s, I think, if I remember correctly. So there was this great discrepancy, and they sent Brother Magdalena back to the States without the 33rd and without the position that the consistory had requested. So this created a huge problem, because now you're seeing that a voting body of Freemasonry is not being heard, and that Paris is exercising some pretty tough authority over them. And again, going back to Brother Louis Wazoo's prediction, if you force the Americans to go against their independence, free-spirited will, you're going to find some backlash. Despite the fact that Brother Magdalena was sent back to the United States and was not given the position that was voted for, the membership continued to support Brother Vera Bressler, because again, I wouldn't say that Masons are pacifists in any way, but they do want to keep the harmony. And so they were like, okay, we don't understand why this is. We're very frustrated, but we will continue to support Brother Vera Bressler. And they wanted, so Paris, what happened is, this is early 1990s, 1992, I believe. The Supreme Council of Le Droit Humain in Paris told Brother Vera Bressler, who is now the head of the American Federation, that they wanted veto power over the board of directors. Now, for those who are not into legalese, the board of directors is a legal entity. So in 1903, the American Federation of Human Rights, or as we say, AFHR, was incorporated in the state of Colorado. And so the board of directors is a legal entity. It is an American legal entity, and it would be the ones that would vote on all of the financial, where things are going and how things are being purchased, and the allocation of monies. So for a foreign entity to come in and tell the head of the order, look, we want you to give us the position that we can veto anything that the board of directors says, flies in direct conflict with American law, with US law, which says that no foreign entity can have veto power over an American board of a nonprofit, which Universal Co-Masonry is a nonprofit and still is today. This is the match that lights the powder keg, if that makes sense. You can look at Brother Calahac as kind of bringing all the ingredients together. Then the powder keg gets packed together during the conflict with the selection of the most puissant Grand Commander. And then the match is lit with Supreme Council coming and saying, look, we want veto power. So again, in order to try to keep the peace, we had several members of the American Federation. The entire board of directors flew to Paris and got on the plane, and they had a French-speaking brother to help them translate. Some of the brothers knew French, but that wasn't, good enough to have this type of conversation. And they wanted to explain to the Supreme Council in Paris why they can't do this. This is illegal, and they don't think that Paris understands that you can't do this. This is applied in the face of American law. So they go to Paris, and the Grand Commander, the head of Le Droit Humain, refuses them to have the interpreter that they requested, gave them another person instead. And when one of the Brother Maximo, went up to try to speak to the Grand Commander, and they were in the room, they were trying to tell him, like, this is how, you can't do this. The Grand Commander did not want to listen. And they were turned away without ever being able to tell them why this is something they couldn't do legally. The entire board of directors flew back the next day to the United States, and they sent out a referendum to all third degree and higher. So voting members in Masonry are third degrees and higher. And they sent out a referendum, and they said, look, this is what Paris is asking us to do. What do you want us to do? Do you want us to follow this edict from the Supreme Council saying that they have veto power over the board of directors? Or do you want to see a severance of our relations with the Le Droit Humain? Back in the day, in the early 1990s, I can attest there was no internet until like 1995, 96. And so this was all done by traditional mail. The referendum went out. They waited several months to hear back. And when they heard back, about 80% of the voting members of American Co-Masonry wanted to sever ties with Paris. They did no longer want to follow an illegal mandate from the Supreme Council. So in 1994, you will see that the American Federation would leave, or they went their different ways from Le Droit Humain. And in 1994, the American Co-Masonry, as it was known at the time, was formed. And the consistory installed their first choice, Brother Magdalena Foncia, into that position. Brother Magdalena received the 33rd from a Supreme Council member, which is Brother Norbert Urzula. He was a wonderful man. I had an opportunity to meet him. He was hysterical. He was from Chicago, and he was a ton of fun. And he always said that he was, he was always afraid to do things, but he was actually a fearless leader. And he had the 33rd, and the 33rd can give the 33rd to whoever they deem appropriate. And so we see that, if you will, an apostolic succession did occur between Le Droit Humain and Brother Magdalena, as Brother Norbert gave her the 33rd and installed in her the position of most sovereign Grand Commander, which is the name of the head of our order. And that is how American Co-Masonry was born. I'm almost out of time here. So over the last 25, 30 years, the heads of our order are ad vitam, which is for life. They do not serve terms. They serve a life term, if you will. And Brother Magdalena has been the head of our order since 1994. And in 2017, American Co-Masonry, we decided as membership that we did not represent fully the international perspective of what American Co-Masonry truly was. We actually went back to a name we originally held, which was Universal Co-Masonry. And that is why we're here today. And that is why we're having this grand story about Universal Co-Masonry, is that it has a very rich history. Some of it very interesting, some of it very unpleasant, but all of it true in the sense that Universal Co-Masonry was once known as the American Co-Masonry, which was once known as the Droit Humain, which was once known as the Grand Orient of France, the Grand Lodge of France, the United Grand Lodge of England, or the Premier Grand Lodge of England, I should say. So there's a long history, and it goes back through the Gilding Ages. It goes back through the ancient mystery schools, and it goes beyond. It's a very, very rich history. And like I said, it was a very brief history, despite you spending an hour and a half with me tonight. A lot of struggles, a lot of growth out of those struggles, but Universal Co-Masonry now is the largest mixed masonry in the United States, although we are the best kept secret because not many people know about it, but we are the largest in the United States, and we're rapidly growing around the country and around the world. And so what we see is that Universal Co-Masonry is a theosophical, adogmatic institution for men and women that doesn't discriminate on any religious creed, but works together to help unite humanity, to help bring about transmutation, not just on the micro level of the individual, but on the macro level of humanity. And we're looking at where we came from and trying to understand what destiny we're supposed to fulfill in this cosmic experience that we all share together as a human race. I am out of time. Right at the half an hour point, I want to thank all of you for coming out and spending this time with me. And Brother Patrick, since we had kind of a dialogue going there for a second, thank you for spending your time. This is a brief history of Universal Co-Masonry. If you have any questions, you can email myself. You can email, if you're working with Brother Rosario, you can email Brother Rosario. You can email info@comasonry.org. It's whatever it's best for you, or you can stay on and ask it after I conclude our remarks tonight. But I want to thank everyone for being here and hearing about where we've come from. And hopefully some of you will decide to join us to see where we go, because it's been, in the 2 decades I've been a part of Universal Co-Masonry, it has been an amazing experience, spiritually, historically, on all levels. So thank you, everyone. And I want to thank everyone that came in from our various platforms from around the world and locally, and in our Philippines series as well. Thank you, everyone. And next month, I believe I said we're going to talk about the government of Freemasonry. We'll see if I hold true to my word, because you know me, sometimes I change it on intuition and go to something different. But maybe we'll talk about government. If not, you'll have to tune in and see what we talk about next. Thank you, everyone. And if you want to stay on and talk, please do so. For the rest of you, have a wonderful night or a wonderful day or wonderful wherever you're coming from. Have a good night.